What's up guys, today I'm going to show you what I consider the absolute cheapest, easiest and most powerful character you can build in Path of Exile for beginners compared to the price and the effort that it takes to make this kind of character. If you are a new player and you want a build that is both cheap and effective and that can take you to endgame maps, then this is it. Thank you for watching. What's up guys, LiftingNerdBro here. In this video I'm going to show you what I personally consider the absolute easiest and cheapest build that will allow you to reach endgame bosses and maps, namely the famous or infamous, depending on where you come from, double Searing Bond Totem build. This build is incredibly solid compared to the currency you have to invest into it. Searing Bond is one of those skills that scales so well with just more levels added to it. And to begin with, it actually requires nothing more than being linked with added burning damage to start doing lots of damage. When getting into later parts of the game, we're then going to transition into a falling. With this build you can basically reach endgame without having to spend more than 10 Chaos Orbs. That's right guys, 10 Chaos Orbs. That is very cheap and I honestly don't know of any other builds that allow you to do that at the moment. I need to warn you though, although this build is able to farm endgame maps pretty efficiently, it is not going to compare against some of the very expensive builds that will clear maps in 1 to 3 minutes. So if that's what you're expecting, then there are lots of other great guides you can try to follow instead. So let me give you a brief explanation of how this build works. The defensive powers of this character lies in its use of iron reflexes that converts all of our evasion rating into armor, along with having 5 endurance charges up most of the time and cleverly using a granite and resistance flask. The way endurance charges works is that one single endurance charge adds a flat 4% reduction to physical damage taken, and 5 of those will then add a 20% reduced physical damage reduction taken, which of course is a significant amount, especially since it's being added to your already existing total physical damage reduction that we have from our armor. As an example, if you with your armor have 30% reduced physical damage reduction, then by adding 5 endurance charges you will now have 50%. Pretty significant. To further utilize the power of iron reflexes, we're running the Grace Aura, which will convert the flat evasion bonus that it provides to armor. Besides Grace, we're also running Vitality to increase our life regeneration. The reason for that is that we'll be using a blood magic skill for our Searing Bond totem later on in the game, and having a good amount of life regen makes that feel so much better. Additionally, this build ends up having 164% increased total maximum life and 1% extra increased maximum fire resistance. All this leaves us with a very high amount of armor and lots of HP, thus making us very tanky. And especially when using a totem build, you also have the benefit of the mobs attacking the totems instead of you in lots of cases. And that of course makes it safer to play. And also, since we're using totems, reflect damage is never a problem, which of course is nice not having to worry about. So before I show you how to link and set up your skill gems, let me just quickly explain to you how Searing Bond works for you new players out there. Searing Bond deals burning damage over time, and for that reason skill nodes such as increased fire damage, increased burning damage, increased elemental damage and damage over time skill nodes and item affixes will improve the damage of this skill gem. Spell damage will not. Remember that, spell damage will not. For this build we're also picking up the keynode Ancestral Bond. This keynode allows us to have 2 totems up at a time, but in turn it also prevents us from using any self-casting spells or attacks. We will, however, still be able to use traps and mines and all that non-self-casting attacking stuff. Ancestral Bond makes it a lot easier to control the battle, as you won't have to use your own body constantly to lead the direction of the fire beam. Even though we're able to cast 2 totems, the beam will only deal damage as 1, and that means that even if we were to hit the same target with with 2 beams, it will only deal damage as 1. To further improve the damage of Searing Bond, we're also taking advantage of the Elemental Equilibrium keynode. Elemental Equilibrium works by increasing the monster resistances to the element they get hit by, but fortunately for us it will also significantly reduce their resistances to every other element. To trigger Elemental Equilibrium to make our Searing Bond Totem deal more damage, we're using an Elemental Trap setup. This trap will deal cold damage, thus making the monsters more resistant to cold damage, but in turn they will now have 50% reduced fire resistance. And that together with our flammability curse will make the enemies very weak against fire damage, thus making Searing Bond deal so much more damage. The reason Searing Bond won't make the monsters resistant to fire damage is that technically speaking, Searing Bond does not use the hit mechanic that triggers the effect that other skills do. Just like Righteous Fire, for instance. But don't worry, I will demonstrate how this works later on in the video. Now, let me show you the skill gem setup we use for this character. For direct damage, we are of course using Searing Bond linked with increased burning damage, blood magic, and increased rarity. As I said in the introduction of this build, you'll only need 2 red linked sockets in the beginning for this build to start working properly. In those sockets you want to place the Searing Bond and increased burning damage skill gems, and when you feel like it you can add in blood magic and increased rarity. If you instead of increased rarity want more damage late game, then adding a leveled Empower gem can be a good idea instead. This skill gem takes forever to level though, and it shouldn't be used until it reaches level 2. Using Empower is by no means necessary, but it will provide a decent boost to our damage, so you may want to consider doing that. At the moment, my Searing Bond is dealing about 7,500 damage per second, and that is without the Elemental Equilibrium and Flammability bonuses that we receive when using those skills. Without the Searing Touch, we are closer to 5,000 DPS, so getting that staff does make a pretty nice difference. And while it isn't necessary by any means, I highly recommend getting it, but we'll talk more about this staff later on in the video. To trigger Elemental Equilibrium and thus making the monsters less fire resistant, we're using the following skill gem setup: Trap, Multi-Traps, Ice Nova, and Increased Area of Effect. When these traps hit the monsters, they will take cold damage and instantly become more resistant to cold damage. But they will also receive the 50% reduced fire resistance penalty, which will make our Searing Bond deal a lot more damage, as demonstrated here in the background. Using a lightning trap linked with chain, multiple traps, and trap is another possibility. I have still yet to decide what I like the most, but for now I'm using the Ice Nova trap setup, as it is easier for me to visually see what it actually hits. To further improve our defenses, we're using a cast when damage taken skill gem linked with Enduring Cry, Molten Shell, and Enfeeble. This setup will ensure that our endurance charges will be up most of the time, which greatly increases our defenses, and this is especially important if you aren't using a shield, and you obviously won't do that if you're getting the Searing Touch staff. For farming level 72 and 73 maps, I found that I prefer my cast when damage taken to be leveled as such: cast when damage taken level 9, Enduring Cry level 10, Molten Shell level 12, and Enfeeble level 10. When farming lower level content, you should start out with having a lower level cast when damage taken set up, otherwise it will probably proc too inconsistently. And the reason for that is of course that the mobs in the lower level areas deal less damage and therefore won't trigger the skill gem as often. If I were to simply farm Lunaris and Piety for that fat loot, I would level my cast when damage taking skill gem to level 4, Enduring Cry to level 7, Enfeeble to level 7, and Molten Shell to level 9. For auras we're running Vitality and Grace linked with reduced mana. Vitality will provide a nice life regeneration bonus, and this is especially nice when using blood magic to cast a Searing Bond Totem, and Grace in combination with Iron Reflexes will greatly boost our armor count. And as mentioned earlier, we're also making sure to use Flammability to further improve our damage by further reducing the fire resistances that the monsters have. For extra mobility, we're using Lightning Warp linked with faster casting, reduced duration, and blood magic. An additional bonus of using Lightning Warp with Searing Bond is that you can quickly move the beam of the Searing Bond in the direction you want. So, now for the big thing. Let me show you the skill tree and explain how I leveled this character. Remember, this is just a guideline, this is just a rough guideline. You can do this in your own way. You don't have to follow my specific recommendations, but these, as I said, just serves as a rough guideline. The first thing I did was to pick up the 40% mana regeneration node and then move towards Celestial Walker, picking up that elemental damage on our way. I then picked Prestidigitation and continued downwards, picking up Discipline and Training and these additional life nodes here. I also picked up this 1% life regen skill node. Later on we will spec out of that, but for leveling it is nice to have. From here on I went back and picked up Elementalist and then proceeded down into these life nodes and athleticism. It is now time to pick up Ancestral Bond, and before you do that you should of course make sure that you have a Searing Bond totem to use. As I mentioned earlier, when picking up Ancestral Bond you won't be able to use any other attacks or self-casting spells, only totems, traps and mines. And the reason we aren't picking up the 8% increased totem damage skill node here is because there are elemental damage, fire damage and burn damage nodes that are more efficient throughout the skill tree for us to pick up. So we will save the skill point for those. To make ourselves a little more tanky at this point, we move towards and pick up this awesome life cluster including Barbarism. From this point on, we will start moving towards this very strong totem cluster where we're going to pick up Ironwood. This time you'll have to make a choice. Do you want the 8% increased totem damage or the 14% increased totem placement speed, or maybe even both? I personally picked up the 14% increased totem placement speed, as it does make a nice difference in how smooth the build feels when playing it. I left the damage node unselected. To make our totems even stronger, we are going to continue from the Barbarism life node area and towards Totemic Mastery. For this totem wheel, we're going to stick to the left side and pick up the skill nodes that will make our totems tankier, and then pick up the Totemic Mastery for that nice bonus to both damage and survivability for our totems. From here on we will pick up some additional life skill nodes, including the awesome Constitution notable you see here. We're then going to pick up Sentinel for some increased armor and evasion, along with 10% to all elemental resistances. If you want, you can pick up Totemic Seal for a whopping 30% increased placement speed for totems. This makes a significant difference, but to get Totemic Seal you will have to waste one skill point by picking up the Totem Cast and Attack Speed skill node here. Since Searing Bond deals a constant damage, getting more attack or cast speed won't improve its damage, and that makes it a waste to pick this skill point. Although I like Totemic Seal for other totem builds, I just couldn't get myself to waste a skill point to get it. So instead I simply picked up the first skill node that provides a nice 24% increased life and 15% increased totem duration. From this point we are going to start moving towards Iron Reflexes. If you're lacking intelligence at this point, you can pick up the 30 intellect notable here. If you do that, you should try to spec out of that later on in the game when your gear will provide the necessary intelligence. Now, let's pick up Iron Reflexes. It should of course be said that if you don't have any evasion on your gear or haven't started to use your Grace Aura by this time, then there is of course no point in picking up Iron Reflexes yet. If that is the case, you should just pick it up later. We're now going to pick up Thick Skin over here and the 2 life nodes that comes along with it. So let's now add some more damage to our Searing Bond. The way we're going to do that is to go back to the Templar area and move up towards the burning damage cluster up here. In this cluster we're going to pick up the 2 burn damage skill nodes to the right, and then finally Holy Fire. And in total these 3 skill nodes gives us a whopping 75% increased burning damage. Pretty sweet. You can ignore the last skill node that will provide a chance to ignite. We don't need that for this build. To get even more damage, we're going to move towards the bottom of the skill tree where we picked up the totem notable Ironwood. From this area we're going to move further down and pick up this fire damage node, these 2 burning damage nodes, and then Arsonist, which will provide us with a nice 18% increased damage and a 1% additional life regeneration per second. Life regen and damage, what's not to like? At this point, if you want to, you can spec out of the 1% increased life regeneration skill node that we picked up in the Templar area. If you by this time have your cast when damage taking skill gem set up ready, and you really should, picking up the extra 2 endurance charges is a good idea as well. So we're gonna do that. Now is also a good time to pick up Unwavering Stance. This keystone node goes hand in hand with Iron Reflexes. As you know, Iron Reflexes converts all of our evasion rating into armor, thus making us unable to evade attacks. Unwavering Stance also makes you unable to evade attacks, but it really doesn't matter since we won't have any evasion rating anyway because of Iron Reflexes. The bonus that we gain from picking up Unwavering Stance is that we can no longer be stunned. And this is a great bonus, especially against Roas and that kind of shitty monsters. You now have to make a decision. Do you want even more damage, or do you feel like you need more life? If you want more damage, you should now pick up Elemental Equilibrium. And as an additional bonus, we're picking up Shaper on our way for that extra life and mana regen. If you decide to pick up Elemental Equilibrium, you should of course by that time have your Ice Nova trap set up ready to make full use of this key node. Otherwise, there really isn't any point to picking that up yet. If you instead want to have more life, which is probably a good idea to pick first if you're playing in a hardcore league, then I highly recommend we start picking up these really awesome life and flask nodes. These skill nodes and the notable Profane Chemistry will provide you with a total of 60% increased life recovery from flasks and 15% increased total maximum life. That is pretty badass, guys. To make our flasks and ourselves even stronger, we're also going to pick up Herbalism and this life node to the left over here for a total of 20% increased maximum life and an additional 20% increased life recovery and flask recovery from flasks. That, along with the previous cluster of life and flask nodes, now leaves us with 80% increased life recovery from flasks. That is almost the double amount of what a flask would previously have given. That is not to be underestimated, and any good Path of Exile player knows that good and smart flask usage is one of the keys to be successful and stay alive in Path of Exile. Trust me guys, it makes a huge difference. The last 8 points we're going to spend for this build goes to picking up the hybrid life and chaos resistance skill nodes up here and the notable Purity of Flesh for even more life and chaos resistance. Now the last 4 skill points will be spent on improving our damage by picking up these 4 elemental damage skill nodes here for a total of 40% increased elemental damage. And that's pretty much it for the skill tree, guys. Remember that if you by any point in time when following this build you start to feel like you lack HP or damage, you can of course just pick up these nodes when you want to. You don't have to follow my specific path or recommendations. As a matter of fact, I highly recommend you always pick up what you feel like based on the situation. What I just show you should be considered, as I mentioned earlier, as a rough guideline for your build. So now, let's talk about how you should level your character until you get your Searing Bond totem. So before you can use and obtain your Searing Bond in Act 3, I recommend leveling by using the Ice Nova skill gem. And this gem can be obtained by completing the first quest of the game that involves killing Hillock on normal difficulty. To increase the damage of Ice Nova as you progress through the game, I recommend linking it with added lightning damage, which you can obtain from Nessa when you get the Siren's Cadence quest, the one that requires you to kill Merveil. From this point on, simply keep using Ice Nova and maybe even Flame Blast or whatever other skill you prefer until you obtain your Searing Bond totem skill gem. When you get that, you should also make the transition into Ancestral Bond that will allow you to use 2 totems. It really is up to you to decide when to add in a Blood Magic skill gem for your setup. There's no right or wrong here. I personally did it pretty soon after I got my Searing Bond skill gem, so I wouldn't have to worry about mana. But it is a good idea to have some life regen before doing it. If you don't want to buy or don't have the currency to buy the Searing Touch Staff, I highly recommend getting a wand, dagger or scepter that has the affix +2 to level of fire gems in this item, such as the one shown in this picture. That affix or stat will boost both your Searing Bond skill gem and your increased burning damage skill gem and of course making you deal more damage. And these items are usually very cheap and can be obtained for 1 alchemy orb or 1 chaos orb, depending on the seller. Getting increased fire or elemental damage on these items is of course an added bonus as well. And now the last thing we're going to talk about is the gearing and stat priorities you should try to aim for on your gear for your character to make it as powerful as possible. And let's quickly summarize what this build needs to function. We of course want life and resistances so that we don't die. That is pretty self-explanatory. To further improve our survivability, we want as much armor or evasion on our gear, and it doesn't matter which one since we're using iron reflexes. And lastly, we want as much burning, fire or elemental damage as possible to make sure that we're able to burn our foes to ashes. And you probably already know this, but it is very important that you realize that being resistance capped when starting out in merciless difficulty is pretty much mandatory. If you aren't by this time, you need to do what you can to get there, or at least get as close as possible. When you are resistance capped, this is the stats in priority you should aim for when changing gear. For defensive stats you want life, armor or evasion, strength, as it provides HP as well, and chaos resistance. And chaos resistance isn't too important, so don't go out of your way to get that. It should just be considered as a, well, nice bonus to have. For offensive stats, we want increased burn damage. Secondly, we want increased fire or elemental damage, and lastly, we want increased casting speed. For Searing Bond, cast speed will only make you cast your Searing Bond totem faster, and it really isn't too important as we're already getting a nice buff to that from a passive skill tree. Since Searing Bond can't crit, there's no point in trying to get critical hit chance or critical hit multiplier on your gear. And as I have mentioned a few times now, I highly recommend that when reaching the later parts of the game that you start to save up for a Searing Touch staff. This staff provides, as shown earlier, a substantial increase to damage by providing a 70% increased burning damage affix, along with a varying increased percentage to fire damage, and lastly 2+ to fire damage and skill gems. Since you only need 4 links when reaching late game and a decent fire damage roll on your Searing Touch, it can be obtained very cheaply. And remember that you don't need a high spell damage roll, and that is one of the reasons that it can be found so much cheaper than if you had to get the spell damage. Last I checked, this staff in the Standard League could be obtained for no more than 7 to 10 Chaos Orbs, and that is pretty cheap. To be able to roll 4 sockets on a Searing Touch, the item level needs to be at least level 28, so make sure to check for that before buying the staff. And for this build you should also get 2 Seething Life Flasks, 1 Iron Skin Granite Flask, a Quicksilver Flask, and either a Ruby, Topaz or Sapphire Flask depending on the content you're farming. Before transitioning over to Blood Magic for your Searing Bond totem, you will also want to have a mana potion to use for your build. If you want to invest some more currency into this build, I will in my forum post link a few uniques and specific items that goes really well with this build. It is however not something we're going to discuss in this video. Oh, and for the Bandit quest rewards, you should help Oak on normal difficulty and kill them all in both cruel and merciless difficulty for the extra skill points. And that's pretty much it, guys. Remember, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them below in the comments or by going to my forum post on the Path of Exile forums. I will make sure to answer any questions that haven't already been answered in this video. Thank you for watching, and bros, do you even nerd?